The COVID pandemic has triggered an entropy-type crisis, characterized by the emergence of new ethical dilemmas that deserves, in my opinion, special attention. In the present occasion, I will deal with only two of these dilemmas. The one concerning the allocation criterion between bearers of equal needs of scarce health resources, and the other one regarding the patentability of life-saving vaccine. Before I go into the substance of this dilemma, I deem it appropriate to clarify the question of a general nature, yet pertinent to the case in question. There is no doubt that the COVID event represents a formidable challenge to politics. For the first time since the Second World War, policymakers in various countries have faced three major problems. First, how to design effective interventions to reduce the spread of infection and at the same time minimize the economic cost of these measures. Secondly, how to measure the extent of the trade-off between safeguarding human lives and preserving the productive capacity of the economic system. Finally, which categories and groups of people should carry the burden of the interventions? Clearly, an ideal model should provide the necessary information for the implementation of the measures, considering equity as a criterion. But such a model does not exist yet, which explains the bewilderment of so many and the rise of bitter conflicts in the political arena. Just to give you an example, policies aimed at mitigating the consequences of fragilities can counter those aimed at mitigating vulnerability. And this happens for the simple reason that while the first type of measures postulate short-term interventions, the latter, namely mitigating vulnerability, require a long-term time horizon. And that is still something that we are, as I said, lacking at the theoretical level. I now move to consider the first ethical dilemma I was talking about. Now, what is the bioethical challenge that arises in the cases of healthcare rationing? Now, consider, for example, the case of triage. If the number of patients to be admitted in is higher than the number of available beds, doctors are forcing to what Guido Calabresi called a tragic choice. Hence, the temptation to abdicate the principle of equal treatment of all individuals in clear violation of the intangibility of human dignity. To shed some light on the problem, it is worth starting from the two main bioethical paradigms still at the center of lively debates among bioethicists and other people. These are the principialist model and the utilitarian one. The principialist model, as it is called, adopts the following logical scheme. It starts from absolute principle and, as such, non-negotiable. From this, one obtains some operational criteria to be applied to the myriad of cases of life that reality presents. A recent application of this model was advanced by many scholars in the September 2020 issue of Science, of the journal, the review Science. It is called the fair priority model in the allocation of anti-COVID treatments. Priority is defined as fair when the following three criteria are met: reducing premature death, minimize the negative consequences of economic and social nature, Third, shorten the time to restore the pre-pandemic situation. Now, what is the problem with such a proposal, with the fair priority model? It's poor practical applicability. And the reason is that it is never indicated whether the three suggested criteria are to be taken in lexicographic order or all three simultaneously. In the first case, the decision-making problem would only be moved to another level. Who decides which of the three criteria comes first? And how much must one criterion be satisfied before moving on to the others? In the second case, the proposal put forward would be almost irrelevant, finding application only to simple and unproblematic situations. What about the other ethical paradigm, the utilitarian one, which is still the dominant one at the international level? Unlike principialism stemming from the deontological ethical metrics, utilitarian ethics considers that it does not make sense to start from abstract, albeit noble principles. In line with the pragmatism of Charles Peirce, this paradigm suggests focusing attention on individual cases, always having as goal the criterion of maximizing the sum total of utilities. Now, can one be satisfied with this paradigm? Of course not. Why? Because to calculate the sum of individual utilities, it is necessary that these are cardinally measurable quantities. But as Wilfredo Pareto made clear at the beginning of last century, personal utilities, not being comparable with each other, can only be measured in an ordinal way, not cardinal. But in this way, we cannot add them up, and therefore the utilitarian approach becomes useless. And this is a real paradox. A remedy to this paradox, so to speak, was advanced in the 80s in the United States with the proposal of the criterion of CALIS. CALIS is an acronym which stands for Quality Adjusted Life Years. It runs as follows. Rationing must be carried out considering the number of years of residual life adjusted for its quality that a certain treatment is likely to ensure. In practice, the adoption of the CALIS criterion implies that it is mandatory to set an entry age limit into, for instance, intensive care. And as you know, this was adopted, for instance, in Netherlands during this crisis and in many other, and even in my country, Italy. Now, the UN report on the index of happiness in various countries, presented in April last year in New York, introduces for the first time another criterion, the so-called well-by approach, which combines the two criteria of quality of life and length of life together. In my opinion, it is a significant first step in the right direction. Yet, medical ethics from Hippocrates onwards has always adopted the principle that one human life is worth as much as another, whatever its health condition. It is obvious that one is free to embrace the utilitarian logic, but then has to be declared right from the beginning, and one should, in a sense, consider the other consequences which stems from that. An interesting line of research, although still far from being fully articulated, is the one started by the Human Flourishing Program from Harvard University, a program founded in 2016, so a few years ago. Now, the basic idea of the Human Flourishing Program is to reject the logic of trade-offs. because it would be immoral to counter the economic consequences resulting from the pandemic to the number of human lives lost. The approach in question escapes this moral trap, considering that many other aspects of well-being contribute to the preservation of life. For example, unemployment, social isolation, and depression increase the risk of mortality and morbidity, as we know. So the approach of total lives saved considers not only the number of lives saved or lost because of the pandemic, but also the number of lives saved or lost because of the above-mentioned factors. It is certainly true that personal well-being and its components are an important marker to take into due consideration. But likewise is the human flourishing, the eudaimonia in the sense of Aristotle, with its constituents such as relationality, the search for the meaning of life, the formation of character. The total lives saved approach, treating all human lives as having equal value, certainly considers well-being, but it does so by assessing its effect on life itself. That is why well-being is seen as a function of life and not as an end in itself. By the way, this approach has important, in my opinion, implication when we come to consider the situation of children, as it is. Because according to the other approaches, children, this morning, some of the people here said, why the children during the pandemic were not so considered? That is the reason. Because the children are not yet productive factors, so they were put aside. And in the hospitalization, we have a lot of empirical evidence indicated exactly that, etc. Of course, there are methodological knots that need to be resolved before such an approach can be concretely applied. And the most important of these is the one regarding the choice of the metric. In other words, how to assign a weight to the various domains of value which are considering. In any case, the starting point, in my opinion, is promising and constitutes a particular application of the ethical virtues of Aristotelian and Thomistic ancestry that represents an alternative to both principialism and utilitarianism. And that is why it is proper to discuss all these issues, because we are still at the beginning of the process. Let me pass now to the other ethical dilemma, namely the patentability of anti-COVID vaccines. We know that the effectiveness of a vaccination campaign postulates its universality. Indeed, vaccinating some social group or some countries only would be of little use. Public opinion generally agrees on the fact that intervention in favor of poor countries is not merely philanthropy, but a strategy of intervention in defense also of the countries of the north of the world. The problem that arises then is not so much the end to be reached, but rather the way, the path to be followed in view of that end. The best solution would be to design a system of licenses controlled and financed by governments, and to mobilize the most effective companies to which to entrust the production of vaccines, maintaining their name and brand. Clearly, this is a project that takes a long time to implement, but there is already an important precedent, namely vaccination against a seasonal influenza. For over 50 years, after the great flu epidemic of 57-58, within WHO, the global influenza surveillance and response system has been operating joined also by numerous public institutions and non-profit research foundations. Experts and scholars from the 110 member countries of this network meet twice a year to analyze and discuss the latest data on new flu strains and decide how to change the vaccine of the year. Now, the system is a remarkable example of what Amy Kapinski from Yale University has called open science, whose goal is the protection of human lives and not the achievement of simply extra profit. This system works well, as you know. So we have already an important example which could be applied to the case under distinction. It will take some time before such a model can be applied to the case of anti-COVID vaccination. But this will happen because what is before our eyes is both unsustainable in terms of economic reasons and immoral in terms of fairness. Two recent measures represent a step in this direction. Last spring, the European Parliament approved the rule introducing the lawfulness of compulsory licenses for vaccines, suspending intellectual property and therefore patents. Recalling what was decided in the year 2005 when patents on anti-malarial and anti-AIDS drugs were suspended. As is well known, it is only from the 1994 TRIPS is the acronym which stands for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, that there are growing constraints to the implementation of an open science, which has created the space for the increasingly intense use of patents and therefore the birth of intellectual monopolies. Today we have intellectual monopolies which do not attract, in my opinion, enough attention from scholars. What then are the arguments, if that is the case, for maintaining the status quo? The first argument is practical, and I can easily skip on that. But this practical argument, according to which patents would by no means guarantee an adequate production of vaccines for the reasons that we know already. But the evidence supporting this argument is very little. Indeed, it is certainly true, but it's a petition of principle. Because if we had started to address this issue in September 2020, when all the elements for taking decisions were already well known, we would not be in the current situation today. Not only that, but if the self-financed COVAX, and Jeff knows a lot about because he was involved in that project and started, but it was boycotted. This project was sabotaged. Gavin Yamey from Duke University, which Jeff knows very well, was one of the co-founders of the project, recently wrote, I quote, "It was a great idea, born of true solidarity. Unfortunately, it has not come about because rich countries have behaved worse than any worst nightmare." I repeat, behaved worse than any worst nightmare, unquote. So that means that people are opening their eyes to the situation. Now, the second argument to maintain the status quo, which has been followed, has to do with the inadequacy of the legal framework as the primary responsible for the lack of vaccine doses. The reference is to the nature of contracts between governments and pharmaceutical companies for the supply of vaccines, a circumstance which has greatly surprised, in a negative sense, public opinion. It was not imagined that the system imposed by the pharmaceutical sector and passively accepted by the world of politics would be able, during the last 30 years, to endogenously modify the rules of market operation. The practice, in fact, was that once a product is approved by the proper agency, government and companies agree on the price and the sale of the product. But the negotiations are kept secret, so that citizens cannot know the final price of all components, and in this way do not know how much is the extra profit component. And this even though a non-insignificant part of the research funding comes from the public funds, that is, from the tax revenue paid by citizens who have been denied transparency. The fact is, monopolies killed the market economy, as any intellectually honest economist knows, at least since Adam Smith. A third argument is perhaps the most delicate. There is a tendency to say that without patents, there would be no longer be an incentive to do research, nor would there be public and private capital willing to take risk. Now, such an assertion is, on the one hand, unprovable and therefore devoid of scientific validity, and on the other, culturally pernicious. In fact, to prove the correctness of the claim, a counterfactual analysis should be prepared to compare the outcome of two scenarios, one without patents and the other with patents. But this is manifestly impossible. On the contrary, it is true that empirical evidence suggests that the patent monopoly regime is in no way encourages innovative activity. Think of the famous case of the polio vaccines invented by Albert Sabin and Jonas Salk, funded with the support of the Roosevelt Foundation and many other individual donors. When Salk was approached and he was asked to patent his invention, he replied, "Can we patent the sunlight?" That was his reply. On the same line of thought, although several years earlier, the famous economist, Nobel Prize winner, Friedrich von Hayek, one of the founders of liberalism in economics, noted that while the ownership of private goods is a consequence of scarcity, intellectual property generates an artificial shortage. And he concluded that the patent was certainly not the best way to support the creativity of researchers. So why many people keep on saying that if you follow liberalism, you should, which is a lie. And we continue to repeat lies after lies, etc. Just to avoid any misunderstanding, it is worth noting that the elimination of the legal institution of patents as such is not at stake here, but only of those which, like life-saving vaccines, have the nature of common goods. Common goods are neither private goods nor public goods. And not only that, but the discovery of vaccine is the result of a collaboration between both industry scientists and scientists active in university and in many research centers. In addition, we cannot ignore the non-reparability contribution of government. But then, if this is the case, why is it that the extra profit, not normal profit, why the extra profits are paid only to the shareholders and not also, according to some rule of proportionality, to all those who have contributed to obtain the results? That is a question to which nobody has been able to provide an answer, etc. I have finished my time, and so better going to conclude. In any case, in the paper, there are all the references which are necessary for those who want to. And I would like to conclude with a general consideration that the possibility is always the combination of two elements. opportunities and hope. It is wrong to think that for something to happen, it is necessary to intervene only on the side of opportunity, that is, on the side of resources and incentives. Indeed, the problems that we face today are not resolved by invoking a mere increase in resources. What is necessary for the possibility to come to be is to insist on the element of hope, which is never utopia. Hope is nourished by the creativity of intelligence and by the purity of civic passion. It is this awareness that opens to hope, which is neither the fatalism of those who rely on luck, nor the misogynistic attitude of those who give up fighting. It is hope that spurs action and enterprise, because the one who can hope is also the one who is able to act to overcome the paralyzing apathy of the existent. Thank you.